What glittering social event was considered the greatest party of the 20th century? And where was it? Was it in Washington, D.C., or Hollywood, or Paris? No, it was at Persepolis in Iran. This extraordinary party attracted 60 royal heads of state, including Grace Kelly, Princess of Monaco, and a glittering array of notables and movie stars from around the world. A fleet of red Mercedes picked up guests and delivered them to the spectacular ruins of the ancient capital of the Persian Empire. Next to the palace and Apadana of Darius, dating from the 5th century BC, guests slept in rooms of a fantastically luxurious, air-conditioned tent city shaped like a star with marble bathrooms. The guests drank champagne and dined on one of the greatest feasts ever recorded in modern times. It included roast peacocks and was catered by Maxims de Paris. I heard about its splendor when I showed Brooke Astor, the New York socialite, around the ancient Near Eastern galleries of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. She proudly told me that she had traveled to Iran for this party, which was one highlight of her very active social life. The grand party was the celebration of 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy in 1971. The Shah of Iran paid homage to Persepolis, one of the 4 ancient capitals. His wife, dressed as if to look like Cleopatra, wore the most astonishing jewels. The Shah had his armies dressed up in an array of ancient military costume. They paraded for the guests, showing them the glory that was Persia's power. The extravagance of that event and the diversion of money which was spent to impress the world led to a backlash. The Shah was overthrown in 1979, and the Iranian Islamic Republic was born. This party at Persepolis was the instigating incident, the one that provoked the ordinary Iranian people, and it helped shape many of the events of the 20th and 21st centuries in the Middle East. Let's look at the famous site of this party, the ancient ruins of Persepolis. Why did the Shah choose to have his party there? Here's why. The Shah was determined to associate his own rule with the beginning of the great Achaemenid Persian Empire. That dynasty was initiated by Cyrus the Great in splendor and might some 2,500 years earlier. It's significant that the Shah would choose this backdrop. The Shah wanted to evoke the great splendor of Persia's past, and this was the place to do it. Empires of the ancient Near East spanned over 3 millennia before the birth of Christ. The empire created by Cyrus the Great and his successor was the largest of all, swallowing up all that came before it. Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians were the predecessors of Cyrus and created some of the most magnificent and striking art of antiquity. This art, as you've seen, was almost all in the service of religion or kingship. Previously, we saw the art that emerged with those very first cities. In Sumer, about 3100 BC, they were establishing the beginning of kingship and its symbols. These symbols developed and became more sophisticated, up to the rise of the truly expansive empires of the Iron Age in the 1st millennium BC. We saw earlier that the art of the kings of Sumer and Akkad began a tradition of demonstrating wealth and power. This includes the extravagant burials at the royal cemetery at Ur in about 2550 BC, and it continues with the ram in a thicket, with the self-deification of Naram-Sin of Akkad and the stela of Naram-Sin. The trend continued in Mesopotamia and beyond. The kings got ever more grandiose in their titles, and their architecture and artworks reflected their worldview. Each empire wanted to outdo the next, so there were ever grander cities, Nineveh, Babylon, and even grander pronouncements of control. King of the universe, king of the four quarters, king of Sumer and Akkad. That was the epithet that the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal used. And that sort of title was true of the Babylonian kings, such as Nebuchadnezzar. The historic continuity was important to them. We can say that there was a real continuity of symbolism in Mesopotamia. Lions, bulls, wild animals, and fertility all played an important role in the art. This symbolism continued to play a role in establishing and legitimizing kingship all the way down to the 20th century AD. But the style had to be uniquely theirs and represent this particular dynasty, the Achaemenid kings. We left off in our last lecture with an examination of the magnificent Ishtar Gate at Babylon. Persian King Cyrus the Great in 539 BC walked through those very gates when he celebrated his conquest of Babylon, and they inspired him. Cyrus founded the Grand Achaemenid Empire, which gets its name from a legendary ancestor named Achaemenes. The word Iran means land of the Aryans, and Persia comes from Parsa, the heartland of this region. Incidentally, Iranians are not Arabs. After conquering Babylon, Cyrus declared in the famous Cyrus Cylinder, a cuneiform clay document which was found in Babylon, "I, Cyrus, king of the world, king of Anshan," and goes on to state that he has restored the temples and cults of neighboring countries and returned their deported people. Most notably, he is credited with returning the Jews to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple. It's been claimed that he was a champion of human rights for these things. But he was really following a general Mesopotamian formula of heroic and just kingship. Cyrus conquered the Medes to the north, and then he wrested control of all of Mesopotamia from its kings, including the empires of Assyria and Babylon. There was never to be a native empire in Mesopotamia again. Cyrus and his son, Cambyses, continued to conquer territory until the Persian Empire stretched from the Indus to the Nile and from Asia Minor to Armenia and Central Asia, Bactria, Sogdiana, and Scythia. It was the great King Darius, the next successor, who built the capital, one of four, at Persepolis, city of Parsa in Greek. He left us with the magnificent palaces and columns of this ceremonial center. It was far south in the province of Fars, near the modern city of Shiraz. Darius had his words written on gold and silver tablets. They were buried in a foundation box at the building we call the Apadana at Persepolis. Darius the great king, king of kings, king of countries, son of Hystaspes and Achaemenian, saith Darius the king, this is the kingdom which I hold, from the Scythians who are beyond Sogdiana, thence unto Ethiopia, from Sind, thence unto Sardis, which Ahura Mazda, the greatest of the gods, bestowed upon me. Me may Ahura Mazda protect and my royal house. Unfortunately, this protective foundation deposit didn't work. Alexander the Great burnt Persepolis down, supposedly in a fit of drunken pique when he conquered it in 330 BC. The Persians, you may know, burnt the Acropolis in the Second Persian War with Greece, so this was the Greek revenge on the Achaemenids. Alexander effectively ended the 3,000-year run of ancient Near Eastern dominion by conquering the Achaemenid Empire. It was at that point, around 300 BC, that cuneiform writing began to be replaced and gradually forgotten. Cylinder seals lost their functionality without clay tablets, and much of the native symbols and styles of art were overtaken by the Greeks. But the last gasp of the Near East, in terms of power and might, was the Persian Empire. In this lecture, we're looking at how the Persian kings, primarily Darius and Xerxes, created monuments to the greatness of Persia. The artworks legitimized their rule as kings. The rulers were truly inspired by the Assyrian and Babylonian neighbors that they had conquered. The Achaemenid kings also used craftsmen from all over to build their cities. In their quest for ever greater expression of grandeur, the Achaemenids built the grand capital of Persepolis in Iran. They incorporated into Persepolis some of the most important and visually striking vocabulary from those Mesopotamian empires they had conquered. You'll recognize them as you see them. Some of the familiar themes we see in the art of Persia at Persepolis include extolling the king's power in his representations, combat scenes of wild animals such as the lion and the bull, scenes of tribute bearers wrought in stone. The tribute bearers, for instance, recall the men bringing in livestock and produce, which we saw as early as the Uruk vase and the Standard of Ur. And the lions and bulls are the most Mesopotamian of motifs. They start to be used in Sumerian times and make a very impressive finale at Persepolis. So, what did the Achaemenids really accomplish in artistic terms? Why is Persepolis considered a masterpiece? Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian who lived in Sicily in the 1st century BC, described Persepolis as the wealthiest city under the sun. But it was more than that. First of all, no cities of this scale had been seen in the ancient world up to that time. The quality of the stone carving, which was not a native art, was extraordinary. It reflects the desire for the ultimate expression of artistic excellence. The size of the buildings, the height of the columns, and the scenes carved upon the stone, they were all meant to be a form of visual propaganda, and the kings wanted only the best. Cyrus the Great made his capital not far away, at Pasargadae. He died in 530 BC and was buried there. His tomb was relatively modest, but he began the tradition of using stone carving, which was not really known in Iran until then. He had to use foreign carvers, in fact. Persepolis was probably begun by Darius in about 500 BC, but sometimes thought to have been begun by Cyrus. Darius used stone carvers from Lydia and Ionia in western Turkey. Wood and mud brick were also used in building Persepolis, but we don't have the remains of those. Darius' successors, after he died in 486 BC, included his son Xerxes, 485 to 465 BC, and grandson Artaxerxes, 464 to 425 BC. They finished the building at Persepolis. How did they do it? First, a huge terrace was cut into natural rock so that the whole of the city was elevated. Sacred and important structures often were built up high in the ancient Near East. Some of the terraces had to be built up, and a grand entrance consisting of a double staircase was constructed to reach the elevated platform. Then a series of buildings was constructed upon it, gates, palaces, and halls of columns. Wooden columns of cedar and stone columns up to 20 meters high supported wooden beams and roofs of matting. All but the stone is gone. The columns were surmounted by huge and complex capitals, double-headed bulls, griffins, lions, and these constitute some of the greatest sculptures from Persia. Capitals and pieces of the column drums litter the landscape today. Elaborate relief sculptures were carved to adorn the staircases and bases of the buildings. These include the scenes of tribute and lion and bull combat. Much of the sculpture consisted of ideas that were taken directly from the Assyrian and Babylonian repertoire, but they were reinterpreted in the more static, elaborately decorative Achaemenid style. Let's see how. For instance, to show you a very clear borrowing, the Persians created winged human-headed bulls that were very similar to the huge Assyrian guardian figures, only these were larger, more rounded, and the ornamentation more stylized. They had the same purpose and the same rationale as the earlier Assyrian ones. They were apotropaic, meant to ward off evil and enemies. But they're Persian, not Assyrian, which you can tell once you look closely. Here, they can be seen guarding the Gate of All Nations at Persepolis. Persian figures had only 4 legs, while the Assyrians had 5. Let's look closer at the Apadana, the enormous square palace with columned hall at Persepolis. This was the largest and grandest of the buildings on the terrace. It had a central columned hall and 4 towers at the corners. There was an upper floor that was reached by staircases in the towers. The king may have used this as a central reception hall, and his throne may have overlooked the Marvdasht plain. This is what it looks like today. The north and east sides of the Apadana are carved with mirrored scenes on the stairways. They show 23 delegations of tribute bearers from every corner of the empire. Another set shows Medes and Persians, guards and attendants of the empire. Originally, the king would have been shown sitting on his throne and receiving the tribute, but these panels are not there now. The delegations were carved into long registers, with each separated by cypress trees and led by a Mede or Persian holding the hand of the delegation's leader. They march towards the king. They each bear a gift characteristic of their land and wear the appropriate clothing to identify them. This careful attention to detail was meant to show the breadth and power of the king. Yet, it recalls a much earlier and very similar type of scene from the standard at Ur. Of course, the size and scale of this is much grander and the movement more formalized and static. If we look closely, we see phenomenal sculptural descriptions of ancient peoples all over the empire. For instance, we see a group from the satrap of Lydia, now Western Turkey, bearing dishes, perhaps ones of gold and silver, and leading a chariot drawn by 2 tiny horses. They are swathed in long, dress-like garments and have hats shaped like beehives. After them come the Cappadocians, also from Turkey, who wear pants with cloaks and strange forward-leaning hats. They bring quite a different-looking and larger horse, which is harnessed. Later, Parthians, or perhaps Bactrians, bring in a Bactrian camel, 2 humps, and wear pants and belted tunics. Even Indians are shown leading in a donkey. Other sorts of tribute shown include textiles and wool, vessels and pots of gold or silver, weapons, bulls, sheep, and other animals and goods. Note that all the human figures are shown in true profile, with their shoulders foreshortened. This is something that was not done in Egyptian art and only occasionally in Assyrian art. These lines of walking but essentially static figures all work together in a sort of rhythmic symmetry. The differences in dress and tribute gifts could be jarring or interrupt the eye. but the smooth, rounded, and uniform style of carving, with lots of repetition, makes it into a cohesive and triumphant long march. Many fragments from this set of reliefs on the Apadana were removed in the past. They exist today in museums around the world, so it's quite likely that you can see a Mede or Persian near you. You also might be lucky enough to see an Ethiopian with an elephant tusk leading a wild African animal if you go to Tehran. Similar sorts of tribute scenes were carved on the other palaces. The clever use of the triangular space created by the angle of the staircase can be seen with these lion-bull combat scenes. This motif is absolutely enormous and dwarfs everything else on the staircase. It harnesses the power of the lion and bull in service of the state's visual propaganda. This lion-bull combat motif is common in Mesopotamia, and its meaning can be construed differently and on many levels. On a purely natural level, it's clear that the lion has chased down the bull, grasped its hindquarters in his claws, and is biting its rump in a bid to topple its prey. The bull, on the other hand, is an imposing wild aurochs. It rears up, turning its horned head back towards the lion. The lion's head is shown frontally, just as on cylinder seals almost 3,000 years before this. The bull is purely in profile. Though this is a dynamic and powerful scene, the Persian sculptors lent it a gravity and stasis by giving the bull two solid legs on which to rear, a steady diagonal line from knee to tail of the lion, and a lack of expression on the part of either beast. The feet of the ascending tribute bearers tread upon the lion and bull heads. This magnificent relief depicts the animals with features that are roundly carved and doubly outlined. It's more decorative and pleasing as ornamentation than wildlife. Yet its purpose, no doubt, included the visual propaganda of demonstrating the king's majesty and aggression through these symbols. On other levels, some believe it could be meant to symbolize an astronomical event, a New Year's festival, or a stasis in powers. The strength and might of the animals and the empire is an unmistakable message, however. The Achaemenid king adopted as his royal seal the motif of him fighting a lion. The Assyrians, of course, showed the kings hunting lions and vanquishing them in their reliefs. The big difference, however, between the Assyrian use of wall relief in general, with its hunting and tribute scenes, is that those were meant for the interior of the palace, whereas the Achaemenids carved all these scenes on the exterior, where they are all obvious to any visitor. Let's see what the capitals of the columns look like. They're the main evidence left for the skill of the Achaemenids in 3 dimensions. It seems that there were 4 kinds: double bulls, lions, griffins, and human-headed bulls, a long series of encircling leaves and volutes, spiral ornaments, lead up from the fluted column to these massive capitals. A bull capital from the Apadana, as you can see, is like a 3-dimensional realization of the bull carved in relief on the stairway. Its 4 parts are shown bent. The saddle between the 2 opposing bulls is meant to hold up the wooden beam which supported the roof. Unfortunately, the bull's horns are broken off. If you compare this bull to the bull we saw on the Ishtar Gate, you can recognize its close resemblance by the position of the lowered head, the graceful curves of the short neck, curly fur, and the veins on its face. The curls of hair, eyes, and the emphasized curves of the neck are shown in double outlines or rows. Muscle features are made into decorative bulges that are also outlined. These capitals were originally painted, so features were emphasized. The columns were created in many different sizes for different buildings at Persepolis. Here are the lion and griffin capitals. You can see the same kind of treatment of details. This makes the animals more decorative than naturalistic. The planes are more smoothly carved than in the Assyrian examples of this type of creature, but the influence is clear. The fine polish on the limestone is extraordinary and unprecedented. The Assyrians were the real inspiration for these sculptural reliefs and capitals. However, at Persepolis, there's influence from a whole cadre of countries, besides the Assyrian and Babylonians, close to or under Persian domination. The Egyptians influenced wing and crown motifs here. The Greeks used their techniques for carving and building stone monuments, and the fluted shafts of the columns are Greek in origin. This is truly an international amalgamation of styles and techniques. We can look at some other high points of artistic expression at Persepolis. These also demonstrate the power and reach of the empire. Though the city was begun by Darius, his successors actively continued building, especially Xerxes, Artaxerxes I, and Artaxerxes III. One noteworthy example of later construction is a doorway from the Hall of 100 Columns. Here we find the figure of a king who we think is Xerxes, but we're not sure. He sits on his throne, holding a flower and a staff of office. An attendant wields a fly whisk behind him. This is very similar to the Assyrian reliefs with attendants. Above the king, at the top, hovers a winged disc of the Achaemenid god Ahura Mazda, looking rather Egyptian with its feathers. A canopy consisting of files of bulls and lions shields him from the sun. Think of all the bulls and lions we just saw in Mesopotamian art. Even more interesting is what's depicted below the canopy and throne. There we have an enormous stool with lion paws that holds the throne. Rows of men support the stool with arms upraised. They're all different, and they represent the groups ruled by the Persians. This includes Elamites, Armenians, Lydians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Scythians, Libyans, Arabs, and others. What a dramatic and effective demonstration of the reach of the kingdom's power and might. This, however, is not a new design. We know something like it from Assyrian furniture depicted on reliefs. And the subject of foreigners is an old and important theme. We'll see a lot more of it here in Persia, in the rest of the Near East, and in Egypt. Plus, there are plentiful other instances of imprisoning or trampling the enemy underfoot and keeping him under domination. Ancient Near Eastern, Egyptian, Andean, and Mesoamerican Maya art is full of this sort of visual reference to the king's power. You can find plenty if you look for it. It's in most of our rulers' art in the lectures that follow. You can observe just such an example of supremacy over conquered peoples from the Achaemenid Empire, not at Persepolis, but at the more northern site of Bisitun, or Beistun. This scene, carved 300 feet high up into a rock cliff, is a classic one, representing a king's victory and control. It's easily understandable in general terms to anyone who saw it. And it was this relief at Bisitun which was a sort of Rosetta Stone. It was inscribed with a trilingual inscription that helped lead to the decipherment of the Old Persian script. The Bisitun relief was commissioned by Darius the Great after 522 BC. It was meant to celebrate his victories over a usurper to the throne and over rebellious kings in his empire. The Emperor Darius is shown trampling his enemy underfoot. This victim is the usurper to the throne, who lies on his back with arms outstretched. Compare this to the Akkadian stela of Naram Sin. Note that the conquering king has the same stance in each work of art, though they were created 2,000 years apart. We'll even see this motif of trampling in our next lecture when we look at the first historical document of Egypt, the Narmer Palette. Another sign of Darius' triumphal domination is also depicted at Bisitun. He faces a file of enemy prisoners who are tied together at the neck by a rope. These are the 9 rebellious kings he conquered. They're each labeled by their countries and called liar kings. They represent the kings of Babylonia, Elam, Armenia, and Scythia. Each is differentiated by his dress. Now compare this to an earlier stela from Akkadian times. We have shorthand for depicting submission of enemy peoples. It involves scale. Enemies are smaller, as well as binding of hands behind the back, binding of necks, and the reviewing line of defeated, slightly bent over prisoners. Let's compare this to something half a world away that we saw earlier, the Moche prisoner file, seen in a clay relief from Peru dating to the first centuries of the first millennium AD. This is unmistakably an effective approach to showing triumph over others. We'll be seeing this later in the course when we talk about the mysterious and creative but violent Moche culture in northern Peru. And we'll see plenty of that in the next few lectures on Egypt. The trouncing of the king's enemies has been an important universal theme. So is the king's glorification in war. We shall leave Persia and the ruins of Persepolis with a last look at one of the glories of Persian might, the famous army of 10,000 immortals who made these victories of the kings possible. Herodotus gave these Persian soldiers, an infantry force, the name 10,000 immortals. He believed that as soon as one was wounded or killed in battle, a new soldier replaced him, maintaining the cohesion and strength of the force. Here are examples of guards at Persepolis. Two kinds are commonly referred to as the Medes and the Persians. One can see how the composition as a whole, using repetition and standardization, gave the sense of stability that the Persian Empire wished to convey. The standing of the immortals was, in fact, so celebrated in history and myth that the last Shah of Iran revived this unit as an elite guard. He wanted to associate himself with the tradition of an empire, most closely with the grandeur of the Achaemenids.